Welcome everybody, and thank you for being here. We're here for a very special webinar on the release of this new report by the Grantham Institute at LSE called Turning Up the Heat. And it's a report that looks at a really important topic on the growing threat of heat risk in the UK, and drawing in particular from the summer of 2022, where we had a number of heat waves, and how we can learn from that experience to inform UK policy on extreme heat. So I am Radhika Khosla. I'm an associate professor at the School of Geography and Environment at the University of Oxford. And I've been working on this area for a while now in a number of different capacities. I lead the Future of Cooling program at Oxford, where our work is to understand and shape the future of global cooling demand. And I've also been the lead author of the UNEP Spotlight report on cooling that was released at the COP last year, called Global Cooling Watch, which I encourage everybody to have a look at, and have been special advisor to the UK government's Environment Audit Committee on the new heat inquiry that was laid out last year. Now, all of this is because, you know, there's a sort of a growing interest in the topic of extreme heat. We don't think about extreme heat as much in the UK, or we haven't traditionally, but 2022 was a really important year, and that's also the year that this report is based on. And the reason why 2022 was so important for extreme heat in the UK was that it's the first time that temperatures rose above 40 degrees Celsius. And that was a landmark moment in many ways, and the Met Office issued an extreme heat warning for the first time. 4,500 people died that summer because of extreme heat, and we know that if we continue with inaction towards extreme heat, that number is just going to get larger and larger, and some of the predictions suggest that 10,000 people per year could die by 2050 if we don't take action for extreme heat in the UK. Some of our own findings at Oxford have also corroborated these results. We did some analysis where we showed that if we move from a 1.5 degree world of warming to a world that is, you know, warmed up to 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and that's very much the trajectory that we're on right now, then the largest relative increase in cooling degree days, and that's an indicator of extreme heat, the largest relative increase in cooling degree days from that jump from a 1.5 to a 2 degree world comes to countries in Northern Europe, and the UK is in the top 3 countries that is going to be most affected. And in simple terms, what that means is that we're really unprepared here in the UK to be able to manage that level of extreme heat. So there's a real urgency to this discussion, and we very much see this conversation as the start of bringing all of us together to be able to talk about this, to be able to recognize the gaps in research and in policy making, and to be able to find pathways together for how we can move forward. Now, to be able to do all of that, we have a really fabulous panel here that I'm delighted to introduce. So we have with us our sort of guests from a number of different groups. So there's Dr. Candice Howarth, who is the head of local climate action at the LSE Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment. And she's also the lead author of the report. And Candice is going to lay out the report and its main findings for us in a brief presentation. Then we have as discussants Andy Love, who is director of Shade the UK, which is a non-profit organization aimed to raise awareness of issues related to climate change and the vulnerable, influencing change in the built environment and public spaces. And then we also have Catherine Brown, who's Director of Climate Change and Evidence at the Wildlife Trust, which is a federation that is made up of 46 wildlife trusts to make a positive difference to wildlife and future generations. So a really interesting mix of perspectives here. The way we're going to organize ourselves for this next hour is that we're going to have Candice lay out the presentation of the report and its key findings, and then we're going to have questions and answers. So we're going to have Q&A, which is going to be all of you in the audience directing your questions to us. Please do use the Zoom Q&A button for this, so you can see that here. below on your screens. And if you can both ask your questions and also vote on the questions that are asked, it allows us to be able to ask the questions that have the most number of votes. So there are two parts to your engagement here, and we'd encourage you to do both. And then I will read out those questions, and the Candice will answer them along with. Then we'll move on to a panel discussion where we're going to have questions again for discussion and questions with Andy and Catherine. And again, if you have questions here, please do put them in the Q&A box, and we will vote on them or you will vote on them, and then we'll be able to have the panel answer that. So that's broadly how we're going to organize the sort of remaining time that we have. I think that's all the housekeeping I have for now. How about I hand it over to you, Candice, to give us a presentation on what the key findings are of this new report that you're launching today.
Great. Thank you ever so much, Radhika, for that introduction. Can I just check that you can see my slides? Great, wonderful. Well, it's lovely to see you all today. Thank you ever so much for joining the launch of this new report alongside two annexes. And I believe the link to the report has now been placed in the chat. So do go ahead and have a read. And this is findings from a research program that we've been running for the last 18 months or so. And it builds on a policy brief that we published last May. And this particular report provides the underlying evidence and supplementary analysis that we've conducted. It's been funded by the LSE and the Place-Based Climate Action Network, and it's involved collaboration with the British Red Cross and Silent Spring Consultants. And we've got a range of co-authors on the report there. And a huge extended thanks to all of those who've contributed in a variety of different ways. Now, as Radhika very clearly highlighted, heat is becoming an important issue for the UK and globally. So 2023 was the warmest year on record on a global level. And in the UK, 2022 was the warmest year on record. And what we're seeing in terms of adaptation to current climate risks is that this is insufficient. It's unambitious, and it's particularly concerning as certain climate impacts are going to become more frequent, more pronounced, and complex to manage. And extreme heat is rising both in its frequency, its intensity, and its duration. And this is becoming increasingly worrying for the UK. Now, the report that we're launching today is based on analysis from the summer of 2022. And I appreciate that's almost 2 years ago now. So if you can try and cast your minds back, you might remember you might have been watching the Women's Euro final up in Wembley, or you might have been going to see Top Gun Maverick at the cinema. So these are a couple of anchors to hopefully position you back into that summer. And that particular summer in the UK was a period where we experienced 5 heat periods over the summer. Temperatures exceeded 40 degrees for the first time. We had a level 4 heat health warning issued. And as Radhika mentioned, we saw thousands of deaths. What we've done is we've put together a small animation to give you a bit of an overview of that summer and some of the wider impacts of heat. So I'll just play that for you now.
In summer 2022, temperatures in England reached over 40 degrees Celsius. Almost 3,000 people died from the heat, and a national emergency was declared. Older people, people with health conditions, the young, and people directly exposed to heat, such as homeless people and outdoor workers, are most at risk. Extreme heat can impact the economy and productivity. It can lead to reduced performance of buildings and infrastructure. Trains can be delayed by lower speed limits to prevent buckling or the expansion of overhead cables. Performance of workers can be impaired in overheated workplaces. Extreme heat impacts food security by damaging crops, harming livestock, and destroying natural habitats. Extreme heat raises the risks of other impacts. For instance, if extreme heat occurs when it's extremely dry, this can increase the danger of wildfires. The impacts of heat can also be felt at lower temperatures than those experienced during extreme heat waves. Acting now, rather than trying to cope when heat waves happen, will save lives, protect nature, and reduce costs. Designing towns, cities, buildings, and infrastructure to be resilient to hot temperatures is vital. Protecting nature and creating space for more trees and natural spaces will help nature to cope and keep us cool. Government is failing to act. Opportunities are being missed to increase resilience. Under a changing climate, Heat waves will become more severe, more frequent, and last longer. Without adaptation, heat-related deaths will increase. Urgent action is needed now.
So as you can see from that video and from the evidence that's already been published, heat is already having impacts on our health when it comes to physical health or mental health. It impacts our economy. Currently, overheating costs up to £300 million per year. And by 2050, this could go up to £950 million per year. It's affecting our buildings and our infrastructure, and it's having widespread impacts to the natural environment. And so this is important, but our policy brief that we published last year concluded that England and the rest of the UK are not ready to respond to these types of events. The National Audit Office last year published its report around government resilience on extreme weather, and it too concluded that there's a lack of clarity on government vision and an extent to which the amount of risk that is willing to be accepted when it comes to heat. The House of Commons Environmental Audit Committee, which Radhika already mentioned, also highlighted the need for more urgency and ambition to enhance our preparedness and responses to heat. And our cities aren't prepared. The London Climate Resilience Review, published a few weeks ago, confirms this. So what did we do? We wanted to explore the decision-making processes and the experiences of the heat waves that were experienced back in 2022. And we looked at decision makers in England, Yorkshire and Humber, London and Manchester to really capture some of those key areas that were affected by those heat waves. We wanted to get a sense of whether UK policies and strategies are adequate when it comes to managing these types of heat risks. And so we spoke to over 200 people through a set of interviews, focus groups, roundtables, workshops and policy analysis. And we spoke to local and national government officials, we spoke to first responders, so we spoke to the ambulance service, the fire brigade across London, we spoke to the private sector, the third sector, and a range of adaptation practitioners. And we've really gauged an amazing set of narratives and stories of those experiences. We've also had a range of input from a range of different organisations, and as I mentioned earlier, this has been a collaboration with the British Red Cross and Silent Spring consultants. And so we've published this evidence report today, and I'll provide some of the highlights in a few moments. But alongside this, I do urge you also to look at the two annexes that we're also publishing. These provide the core raw data, some of the interview quotes that we had from the perspectives and experiences of those different stakeholders, those ambulance services, the fire brigade, but also across the different locations. So you get a real flavour of what's been coming out from the research. And so what did we find? Well, back in 2022, across those areas that we focused on, so England as a whole, London, Manchester and the Yorkshire and Humber region, there are a range of issues that were mentioned in terms of the lack of preparedness to heat. So there's a real sense that there's a lack of resources, of funding and capacity to implement the responses and to cope with the heat, particularly considering the magnitude of the hazard at the time. There's a real sense of crisis fatigue. So whilst dealing with this particular risk, some local authorities, for example, were still at the tail end of the COVID pandemic, and there was a real sense of exhaustion. And alongside, there's a real sense of a lack of staff and personnel and people with the right expertise to deal with these types of events. There were a number of ways that were highlighted to improve this preparedness and sets of strategies that could be highlighted. So what really came out prominently from the research is that we can learn from other countries who have far more experience than we do when it comes to extreme heat, but also countries who are a similar journey than we are when it comes to extreme heat. For example, the city of Paris are doing exercises to look at their resilience to 50-degree heats in the city. There needs to be timely and coordinated responses to really tackle those most vulnerable to heat, whether it be people working in offices, people exposed to the heat, people under the age of 1 and over the age of 65, and those with underlying health conditions. And I mentioned earlier this sense of crisis fatigue, but what came out of the findings was that some of the networks that had been put in place to engage with those most vulnerable during the pandemic, those same networks were used to then engage with those most vulnerable for the heat. So building on that historical knowledge was really crucial. But what also really came out of some of our findings is when we spoke to some of the local authorities, they were saying that it was already hard enough for them to get funding to deal with energy efficiency priorities, let alone priorities for adaptation. There's a real need to strengthen policies, legislation, and regulation. This really came through in all of our discussions. There's a real sense that there's a lack of forward-looking, a lack of long-term thinking when it comes to heat, and very much short-term responses and immediate responses were put in place when it came to the heat. Alongside this, there was a real sense of a lack of joined-up thinking, so government departments not talking to each other, organisations not having those mechanisms in place to ensure who was deployed at what times. And so there's a real need to adapt and to tailor these strategies across different government departments, across different sectors, but also across scales, looking at the local, regional, and national perspective. Another interesting aspect that came out in terms of one of the gaps, or one area that isn't looked at in great depth, is the impact of heat on rust sleepers. And the perception tends to be concern for rust sleepers in cold conditions and a lack of understanding of their exposure and vulnerability to extreme heat as well. And there was widespread agreement that the UK public doesn't fully understand or isn't fully aware of their vulnerability or the impacts of heat to themselves. Indeed, some researchers highlighted that people who are most vulnerable, say those over the age of 65, tend not to identify as vulnerable themselves. And those vulnerabilities don't just extend to those groups that we know of, it's also people working outside. So for example, we spoke to the London Fire Brigade, and they were talking to us about the number of fires that they had to tackle, that this was the 19th of July 2022, where we saw those 40-degree temperatures, was the busiest day for them since World War II. And one of them described their experience as going into 40-degree heat wearing a duvet, considering all the equipment that they have to wear to protect themselves. So the vulnerability needs to go beyond those groups that we're typically aware of. There were a range of other issues that were highlighted. So as I've mentioned before, and Radhika's already mentioned, our poor housing stock contributes to temperature-related mortality. Buildings in the UK tend to have been built to keep people warm in the winter, less so to keep them cooler in the summer. And with that, there's a lack of understanding of the compounding risks, so things that make the impact of heat worse. We heard in the video about if there are extended periods of drought, this can increase the likelihood of wildfires occurring and spreading rapidly. And with that in mind, what came out of these discussions was a real recognition that whilst adaptation and preparedness for these types of events is critical, this needs to go side by side with mitigation. So strategies to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, really to ensure that methods that are put in place to keep people cool, stay inside buildings, and don't necessarily increase the use of energy-intensive measures such as air conditioning, but that really help to minimize those local energy emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, and local heat increases. Now, with that in mind, we've identified a set of priorities that could constitute a national heat risk strategy. As I've just mentioned, climate change mitigation and reducing greenhouse gases needs to be a priority at the centre of this. But adaptation also needs to be central to protect public health, our infrastructure and ecosystems from the immediate impacts of extreme heat and those that are predicted to increase. We need real policy leadership. We need leadership from a central government department working alongside other government departments to ensure cross-sectoral approaches are put in place. And with that in mind, this needs to be integrated and co-produced with a range of different stakeholders so that we're engaging with the Ministry of Justice, the Health Department, the Education Department, and so on. We need a set of regulations and benchmarks that can address the factors that make heat risk worse across different sectors. For example, we need to start looking into whether or not we need to set a maximum workplace temperature. And we need to adapt the built environment to reduce overheating in homes, buildings and infrastructure that tend to be particularly vulnerable to overheating in these conditions. So we need a whole society approach that it focuses on heat all year round, not just summer months, and it needs to have at its core an aim to protect the most vulnerable. And so this national heat risk strategy really needs to be coordinated by a single government department with input from all of the other government departments. It needs to have a very clear vision with both short and long-term actions and priorities. It needs to be co-produced. It needs to involve engagement and alignment with the needs of those who are most vulnerable and who are working on the ground. And it has to have broader considerations for issues relating to inequality, justice, and fairness. And some of the questions that might guide the development of this strategy could be, well, what is the vision for heat resilient adapting UK? What can influence heat resilience and adaptation across scales and sectors? And what are the windows of opportunity to act now over the next 12 months, not in 5 years' time? And with that in mind, we're prioritising a set of research projects here at the Grantham Institute. We're doing some analysis of heat perceptions, where we're analysing a survey that we launched last summer. We're looking at building overheating metric research with Shade the UK. And we're looking at some work around combining adaptation and mitigation approaches for heat preparedness with the British Red Cross. So I'll stop there, and thank you very much for your time, and I'm very happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you so much, Candice. And it's really great that we have this report out now as a starting point for the conversation on heat. I'm going to encourage everyone in the audience to type their questions in. I see 2 questions so far, but it would be great to have some more. So let's begin with what we have, but please do type your questions in, as we have about 9 minutes or so for questions, and then we'll come back to them as well. So Candice, the first question here is, Woody asked that your team consulted very widely, but did you look and include the agricultural sector? There are many outdoor workers here, and food security depends on reliable water at a time when confidence in the water utilities is also very low. So how rural or agriculture based were your results?
Great, thanks, Radhika, and thanks very much for that question, Woody. It's a very good question. We did engage with the National Farmers Union, and we did look at a rural perspective and look at farmers on a more high level. We didn't have the capacity to really drill down into that particular focus, as the evidence does suggest that obviously urban areas are the most affected by heat, but we're increasingly interested in that rural dimension, the impact of heat on farmers, outdoor workers, on crop growth, on those crops being destroyed. And this is why we engaged also with Catherine from the Wildlife Trust to really get a sense of how the heat is impacting the natural environment, which is it's not been under-researched, but it's not getting as much prominence as it should be. We rely very heavily on those types of natural resources, and the natural environment is going to continue to be affected. And I don't want to steal too much of what Catherine's going to say later on.
Great, thanks. Okay, so we have one more question, and again, I encourage the audience to ask some more, or I see some more coming in. That's good. All right, so Carl from the Resilient Cities Network has a question, and it's related to the work that they're doing in the Greater Manchester area, where they're building community resilience to climate risks. And actually, Manchester, I think, is one of the first regions to have a city officer as well for extreme heat in the UK. They've had trouble finding robust data and methods to identify communities that are at risk and vulnerable regions, and they ended up using the Climate Just program methodology. So the question is, it would be great to hear whether the Climate Just work informed this report, or whether you have suggestions or recommendations as to prioritization areas for heat resilience work.
Yeah, thanks very much for that question, Cara. Yeah, it's really, the Climate Just tool is a really important tool. There are quite a range of different tools out there, and sometimes it can be a bit difficult to know which ones are the most effective to use in this case. We didn't use this one directly to inform our thinking. We were very much driven by the vulnerable groups that were identified from the stakeholders that we spoke to. But we did try and be as comprehensive as possible in trying to capture as many of those groups as we could, and look at ways in which some of them might need to be redefined. So when we first started this research almost 2 years ago, there had been conversations around vulnerability in terms of people's age groups. And historically, it's very much been looking at people over the age of 75, but that age bracket has now been lowered to 65. So we're particularly interested in also how those definitions of vulnerable people and vulnerable groups have evolved. You might remember last summer, the summer in the UK wasn't particularly exceptional, but it was across the world in many countries around the world. And I think one of the first European deaths related to heat was a road worker in Italy, who I think was in his early 40s. So we're really interested in identifying additional vulnerable groups that don't necessarily get as much prominence when it comes to these types of strategies or this evidence, so that we're really capturing how heat is having widespread effects across society and the natural environment and the economy, and how it might be affecting people directly in terms of mortality, but also in terms of educational attainment, productivity, exacerbating existing inequalities. So this is very much a beginning of a journey for us to try and understand a little bit more how heat is going to affect those particular groups more going forward, and what needs to be done to address that.
Great. Okay, so Neil asks, Was there any consideration of particular types of buildings that might be most vulnerable, and why many new buildings seem to have minimal consideration of future heat risks? It's a question that's got voted the most, and I think it's a really important question. So it'd be good to hear on that, Candice.
Great, thanks, Radhika, and thanks, Neil. And also, it would be nice to sort of pin that for the discussion later on as well, because I think it'd be great to get Andy and your perspective as well, Radhika, on this. We didn't focus on a particular building type. Again, we were quite interested in gathering those narratives and those understandings across a range of different building types and environments. What did come out, though, is certain buildings that had different functions were particularly badly equipped to deal with heat. So hospitals came up, ambulances came up, different types of work settings that were mobile, for example. What did come up also in the research was how heat affects different parts of the same building, so top floor flats or basement flats, and how that vulnerability can be compounded. So, for example, people living in cities such as London who live on the ground floor, the basement floor, may not be willing to open their windows at night for security reasons, hence leading to an issue of, if there's not enough ventilation, of them overheating in their buildings. So some of the work that we're going to be doing with Shade the UK is looking specifically at different building types and whether or not we need overheating metrics in those different building types. But for this particular research, we were really trying to gauge the human experience across a different range of building types, but not just buildings, work environments. And as I mentioned, the ambulance service and the fire brigade, thinking about the vehicles that they use to go to put out a fire or go to identify patients to transport to hospitals. So whilst the building aspect is obviously a very crucial and important one as part of this work, we need to be considering the broader environments within which people reside and work throughout the rest of their days.
Thanks, Candice. So David asks another water-related question, which is, did you find any concern about supplies for firefighters? I gather that the water pressure drops during droughts and water use goes up during heat waves.
That's a really good question. Thank you, David. That didn't come up when we spoke to the London Fire Brigade. No, they didn't. The issue of water supply didn't seem to be something which was on their radar. But we did talk to utility companies and water companies, and they tend to have a longer term plan in place when it comes to their water usage and water supply. Hence why we might have bans on water use. What they did tend to say is that they did need to monitor water use. And this is where it really highlighted the need for an increased public awareness and understanding campaign, because they were really trying to get the message out that they were trying to discourage people from filling their pools, emptying their pools and filling their pools, or showering more than once a day. So it's trying to get those individual behavior measures in place for people to understand that during certain periods, didn't have to be the whole period, that they shouldn't really be overusing water, to try and think about the implications for the wider network. But as far as I'm aware, the water supply for extinguishing fires didn't come out itself. With the fire brigade, some of the concerns were more about the uniforms that they had to carry, which kept them warm, the fact that they were dealing with multiple fires at the same time and having to go from one side of London to the other side of London, having to deal with heat stress and burnout, excuse the pun, of some of their staff, a very small minority of which had also to be treated medically because they were suffering from heat stress. So there's a range of compounding factors then that did emerge from those discussions.
Great. So I'm going to sneak one question in before I ask our panelists to respond. So Jeannie asks, could you expand on any research you're aware of related to who the most socially vulnerable to extreme heat are? There are the loose groupings like outdoor workers and the elderly, but do you have anything to share that drills into these more? Could any of these at-risk groups be put in a priority order, for example?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thanks, Julie. You're right, there are different types of categorizations of these at-risk groups. The UK Health Security Agency tends to focus on those who are most vulnerable. So children under the age of 1 and under 5, people over the age of 65, people with underlying health conditions. And so they each are prioritized through the heat health alert system that the UK HSA launches. And these broader groups around vulnerable workers, exposed workers, there is some evidence out there which we can certainly point you towards. There is, I think this is a growing area of research that needs to be explored in more detail. I did mention earlier that we don't have a statutory maximum temperature for indoor working. And that's something that needs to be taken into consideration around some of the wider issues that may emerge if, say, for example, an organization decides that their environment is too hot and isn't safe for their workers to work in, whether that's just working at your desk. And so they advise people that they can work from home. But there are no safeguards in place to ensure that people working from home will be any safer, that their homes will be any cooler, particularly if, compounding that, working environments may be doing that, but also schools may decide to close for the day because it's not safe for children. So you have people working from home, having to care for children at the same time as trying to do work under conditions that may be less safe than had they been in their offices. So there's this is more a question to your question, but there are a range of different vulnerabilities that we do need to look at in more depth. And we need to look at this now so that we get ahead of ourselves and we're able to target those vulnerable groups in a safe and sustainable way before these types of events start happening more frequently and in a more intense way.
Super. All right, thanks, Candice. So I'm going to ask Andy and Catherine to respond to Candice's presentation and the Q&A so far. So perhaps, Andy, I can ask you to go first for 5 minutes, and then Catherine, if you can go after that, that would be great. And we'll come back for another set of Q&A after that.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Andy Love, founder of Shade the UK. Shade the UK is all about adapting the built environment and public spaces to protect the vulnerable against the changing climate. Next slide, before we get too dizzy. This is Shade UK's theory of change. At Shade the UK, we feel it is important to consider the human story, not just the statistics. Among several initiatives, we've been gathering anecdotal stories from people about their experience of the 2022 heatwave. This is to learn about the more nuanced issues regarding overheating and climate change in the UK. We also want to understand from vulnerability groups how real people are dealing with overheating, especially if issues are combined. We found out that maternity ward aircon systems failed, hospital and hospice fridges and freezers holding critical medicines failed because the outdoor aircon systems are designed to a more temperate climate. People living in exposed west-facing flats slept on their kitchen floors. Wildfires destroyed homes. We realized workers working outside lacked legal support during these conditions. Supermarkets lost produce. Farmers lost livestock. I could go on. We also found out there is still no real way to track exactly why the thousands of people died. There's a lot more work that needs to be done. We have an architectural crisis in the UK, and that is buildings overheat. We also have streets that are too exposed with lack of green cover, and our green spaces are too far away for those that need the most. When we have another heat wave and the temperatures rise above 40 degrees Celsius for a day, unfortunately, there will be more than 3,000 excess deaths again. If the 40 degrees Celsius temperature is prolonged over a period of a week, this could be catastrophic. For the past couple of decades in the UK, we've been building homes with full height glazing, completely exposed to the sun. For now, we mostly have fit and healthy people living in them, but when that demographic changes in the future, we are in trouble. So we need to act now, especially when money is being spent on retrofit measures for reducing energy bills and carbon emissions. Now is the time to act. I've personally been working in the built environment industry as a sustainability consultant for over 13 years, largely working in planning. With the introduction of Part O building regulations, we are winning the battle with new buildings regarding overheating and planning, it feels. However, most of the buildings that vulnerable people reside in already exist, and we need them adapted, focusing on hospitals, hospices, care homes, social housing. We also need to think about outside the home and consider making sure there are more cool spaces and green infrastructure so there is equity in people enjoying the outside during the summer. All of this is why Shade UK was started. This is our theory of change. Have a look around. Our mission, our final mission, is to have 0 deaths from overheating in the UK. And I'm glad to be working with Candice at the start of this project and a few projects we're working on to get this moving. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Andy. Catherine.
Thank you very much, everybody. So I'll just speak for a couple of minutes as well, because we want to have more time for questions. I know many of you on the call. I recognise a lot of names because I've been working in this space for a good 15 years now, if not longer. But obviously in my current role, I'm very focused on the impacts of climate change on the natural environment, and also how nature can help us to adapt to the changes that we're already experiencing and that are coming. And Candice asked me really to shine a bit of a light on the nature impacts, because as she's mentioned, these are not widely reported and they're not widely measured when we talk about heat risk in the UK at the moment. And yet in 2022, we noticed across all of our sites across the UK, and the map on the right shows you just how dispersed and widespread our sites from the Wildlife Trust are. We have over 2,500 nature reserves across the UK. We saw a whole range of things happening. We saw wildlife suffering from dehydration, unable to find food. We saw quite a lot of nesting failure as chicks either died directly from heat or from lack of food being brought in by the parent birds. And we saw lots of habitat-wide impacts. We've talked about wildfire already, and this is really one of the most significant risks that's on my radar. We saw over 1,000 hectares of our own land severely damaged by wildfire in the 2022 wildfire season. And this fire, water, heat nexus, this combination is really concerning and important for how we think about adaptation in the natural environment. So for example, the competition for water, David's question has already touched on this. The competition for water increases, and actually nature is usually the sector, if you want to think about it as a sector, that loses out. In 2022, we saw the Thames, the source of the Thames, drying up for 5 miles downstream. I mean, that's an incredible impact that wasn't widely reported. And we know that some of our most precious habitats, particularly including those for carbon storage like peatlands and other wetlands, are at extreme risk from heat and drought as well. And the work that's been done over the years showing the vulnerability of peatlands to climate change shows that 2/3 of peatlands could be lost in the future because of hotter, drier conditions, unless they're already in good condition. So we know that these impacts are happening. We're trying to measure them as best we can, but also the effects of nature as a solution for people to climate change, to extreme heat, is equally as important. Those pictures of Greenwich Park early on in Candice's slides show it really well. We know that the cooling ability of green space drops dramatically during extreme heat episodes. And in 2022, I think for the first time I've ever seen this, we saw trees defoliating, so they dropped their leaves during the summer, and we actually had a second spring in the autumn where they started growing leaves again. And those trees were under a huge amount of stress. We have seen trees being lost subsequently, and sometimes there's a time like that might happen the year after. But we know that these habitat impacts are getting more extreme, and what we don't have a good handle on yet is at what point these habitats may tip, and actually we start to see catastrophic losses. So if you go on to the next slide, Candice. What we're doing about it, this is just a lovely example that I like a lot. We are acting, we are doing a huge amount that isn't also necessarily being measured. And we're not waiting for government to tell us. We're doing it ourselves and doing a huge amount across the country. This pile of soil in Bedfordshire is a butterfly bank. This is something that the BBC has been covering for us for the last couple of years. This was actually a photo taken from some filming they did for Countryfile. And what these are is they provide microclimate habitats for butterflies in extreme heat. So you might not think that insects like butterflies are particularly vulnerable, but they do. Their activity drops hugely in extreme heat, and so does their feeding activity. And creating these microclimate habitats like these butterfly banks, we're showing through research, the University of Cambridge is doing some research on this particular project, that they are having an effect, and making changes, landscape type changes like these over time has a huge benefit to some of these species to help them through these extreme events. We're doing huge amounts of peatland and wetland restoration across the UK, particularly in some of the driest parts of the country. So if we think about the Wildlife Trust for Beds, Cams and Northants, who also do the butterfly banks, they have an enormous partnership project called Great Fen, looking to restore 3,000 hectares of peatland in East Anglia, where we know some of these risks are highest. We're doing riparian cooling, so planting trees along rivers to keep water temperatures cold or cooler. We're changing the management of our coastal wetlands, where we're seeing quite high increases in aridity levels. we're releasing beavers all over the country, and beavers have a wonderful effect on local ecosystem function, and they hold water in the environment. So this drought, fire, heat nexus problem, beavers can really help us in those conditions. And again, research is showing that they're having those effects. And finally, we're working with communities. I noticed Jack was on the call, so I'd be very remiss not to mention the brilliant work of Somerset Wildlife Trust in engaging communities and doing community-led adaptation programs. So using the voices of communities to come up with our own adaptation plans across the country. So there's a huge amount going on. It's not happening at the scale we need, but the final point I just wanted to make was that we do see a huge amount of public interest in this. I noticed David was on the call, and actually the media interest that we get for impacts on wildlife during heat waves is one of our most frequent queries, actually, when we have media queries to go on the news or the radio. So we know there's a huge amount of public interest in this. We just need to see some of those policy shifts to enable us to work at this at much higher scale. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Catherine and Andy. So let's take a little bit of time and have some Q&A with everybody now, with Andy, with Catherine, with Candice. I'm going to return to the Q&A box. I know there are some questions that have been voted up quite a bit, so I'll start with that, but please do continue to ask your questions and to vote on them. So we have about 15 minutes to talk together now. So the first question is from Kristen, who says, thanks for the presentation. And though I agree that adaptation should be delivered alongside mitigation where possible, I wonder if our insistence on always linking the two ends up lumbering heat resilience retrofits with the problems and challenges that have always plagued mitigation retrofits. Could we not just call for a heat resilience retrofit program on its own, especially that given some of the measures like shading can be implemented relatively quickly? I worry that people will die in their homes while they're waiting for mitigation retrofit programs to deliver adaptation. So perhaps, how about I read out two more and then we can sort of, turn it over to the panel. And I'll also request the audience to ask questions, not just of the report at this point, but also to Catherine and Andy. So another question asks, what are the alternative options if the government continues to deprioritize funding to invest in infrastructure and retrofitting properties, etc., to protect people from heat risks? Are there any alternative funding that we can rely on from the private sector, for example? So how about I pose those two to the panel, and then we come back for more. Who would like to go? Yeah,
I'm happy to answer.
Yeah,
maybe a bit of both. So it's about having an adaptation strategy straight away. I think what you have at the moment is you've got large amounts of money that are going into decarbonisation plans, for instance, for social housing. That's a real opportunity for us to bolt on adaptation as part of that funding package where billions is already being spent. There's a little bit of a missed opportunity there. And there is a potential for immediately doing something about that if rather than dragging our heels. If we can utilize funding that already exists, we can, at the same time, whilst we're retrofitting properties, putting shading measures. That's a lost opportunity. That's just an example. There's also barriers in the way that are stopping things from happening. For instance, with heritage do have a quite large say in planning. And any homeowner knows that they're probably put off doing anything on their facade, like putting in external shade or external shutters, because they're worried that they have to jump through so many hoops, let alone putting in green infrastructure. And then if I just pick up on the second point, the alternative funding, I think there's lots of creative ways in which we can look at this. As a business owner myself and working in the planning sector, I see that there's lots of money being handed over at the point when a developer gets planning. Section 106 agreement in London, you have a carbon offset payment. Why don't we think about an adaptation payment as well, or utilize the carbon offset payment, not just for mitigation measures, reduction in carbon emissions, but also for adapting schools, children's day centres, hospices and hospitals. I'll stop there.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. I'll just come in, particularly on the second point. I think when we think about nature-based solutions for heat, one of the really key things about them is that they're cheap. So they're very low cost to do. The most expensive types of measures that we would put in place, which help nature and people, are landscape scale changes. So things like landscape scale peatland restoration projects. There is a lot of private finance coming in for those, and that is growing. There's certainly a big emphasis now on nature-related markets, and I think the finance that's coming in through those for adaptation-related activities is not being counted as an adaptation for extreme heat, even though it is. So I think the picture is probably slightly more positive than we might think looking at government statistics alone. However, I think what's missing is the coordination activities, and we, Candice has picked this up in her report, and we see that all the time. It's bringing together those different policy levers so that finance flows much more easily and much more quickly to where it's needed, and that's where we see the struggle, particularly with nature-based solutions.
If I could just add to that, I just wanted to go back to the first question that Kristen asked about the adaptation mitigation synergy. I agree, we don't want to distract or move away from what the ultimate priority is, which is to ensure that we're prepared, ensure that we're protecting those most vulnerable, and shade the UK's ambition to ensure there are no deaths from overheating should absolutely be a priority. I think that the point there would be about ensuring that we have a combination of measures that are in place. So individual and behavioural measures, getting people to understand what are some of the individual things that they can do to start reducing their vulnerability or their exposure to heat, alongside those that are happening across different scales as well. So if we're looking at building regulations, for example, if we're looking at different strategies that are in place to make sure that there are considerations for what this might mean for unintended consequences. So we don't want to be encouraging the use of cooling technologies if that means that there's going to be a huge increase in energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions. And some of these measures also do lead to increased local heat temperatures as well. So we need to be looking at this from a whole systems perspective.
Thanks. So there's a nice segue from what Catherine was talking about to the next question, which again, I'm going to sort of open to everyone on the panel. So Neil asks, you mentioned that a heat strategy being coordinated by a single government department would be good. Which department do you think that should be? And then we have another question from Claudija, who is the Climate Emergency Officer for the Westminster City Council, who says, what should the role of local authorities be in terms of heat preparedness and protecting residents? What are the main things we should incorporate into our adaptation plans for better heat resilience? So how about I pose those two really important questions to everybody?
I'm happy to go for the last one. It's probably not me to say about government. So that's about what is the role of local authorities. I understand that local authorities are under immense pressure, and immense pressure from lack of funding and all the issues that we've seen recently. But what they are really good is facilitating, connecting the dots and opening things up and taking away barriers. One thing in particular in London that could be done is for there to be additional supplementary planning documents that allows for permitted development of certain measures that can be included for houses, so that you do not need to go through planning, a little bit like what I said before. They can work with businesses, open up doors for projects to work with local communities. They can do those kind of things without actually spending too much money. I think it's about taking away the barriers that local authorities can do, rather than necessarily spending waves of money in this particular area, and that would be potentially more useful.
Yeah, I'll come in very quickly on the first one. I know Candice has views on this as well. I mean, we've recommended to government that the adaptation policy should move into Cabinet Office from DEFRA as an overarching function. And one of the reasons for that is that there is a gap between what DEFRA sees as its long-term adaptation planning function and the Cabinet Office's short-term National Risk Register function, where it's looking at extreme events. And really those two things are now converging. Maybe 10 years ago, we might have still seen adaptation as a long-term problem, but it no longer is. And when you have those conversations with officials, there is still that disjoint there. And we also do think that in the National Risk Register that a lot of these risks are still being underestimated, the level of risk at the minute. If you look at wildfire risk, for example, have a look in the National Risk Register and see what they say, but I think that risk is underestimated. So we'd really like to have an overhaul of how that risk assessment process is done across government. Candice, I know you have views on this.
Yeah, well, just to add to that, really, Catherine, I think we agree on that, and I would just re-emphasize the point that you need that leadership from a government department, but you do need that collaboration and that cross-government departmental working as well. That's really crucial. Certainly, everything that we've been touching upon in our discussion has hinted to inclusion of, obviously DEFRA. We need health involved, we need the Ministry of Justice, we need education, we need business. So this is really something that needs to bring on board all of those different government departments, which would add a level of complexity, obviously, but that's why you need that single government department driving the efforts, but really with a co-produced inclusive element to it, to ensure that as much as we can integrate and we can be touching upon many of those priorities that we've highlighted in the report, address many of the vulnerable groups that we've mentioned and that we've discussed, to ensure that we're dealing with this in the short term, but with a longer term strategy in place as well.
Great. So let's do a couple more before we wrap up. So Kate asks how to best communicate the risks of heat to the UK public. And I think that's actually a really important question in light of this report. And then a nice way for us to segue into thinking ahead is the question around which says, you mentioned priorities for the next 12 months and the need to act now. This time period will include a general election. What would you like to see from current government, election manifestos, or any new government to reflect the findings of your report? What do you think the political appetite for heat resilience is?
Shall I start just to go on the public attitudes one?
Absolutely.
So I think there is good evidence that public understanding of the risks from heat has increased markedly over the last 10 years, and we've seen a lot of research that shows that. So generally speaking, the public are much better at connecting climate risk and extreme heat than was the case 5-10 years ago. So that's promising. I think the UK HSA, heatwave extreme weather plan is very good. It probably is more aimed at public sector bodies and the health service. I wouldn't think that many people go and read it themselves. But we do see with the Met Office's extreme heat warning last year, we had the first ever heat red alert for extreme heat across the country. We responded to that. We closed our office, going back to this point about where are people most and least vulnerable. Our office is not air conditioned. And we actually put in place effectively a mini crisis management plan for our staff. We know who our vulnerable staff are. That alert caused that action to be taken. I think that's really valuable. I think we just need more of it. And we need to have the media picking up on this. Somebody else in the Q&A has raised the point that whenever there's a heat wave, the pictures in the media are always of people on the beach seeming to have a good time. They are not of people lying in hospitals. And I think that public discourse about what extreme heat really means needs to change.
I'll just come in and add to that. I completely agree with what Catherine's just said. I think on the communication side of things, that awareness is there, that understanding is there. But some of the compounding issues which make it a little bit difficult for people to then enact on that awareness also exist. Although, as Catherine mentioned, media portrayals, they have improved significantly over the last few years. The coverage of heat tends to be certainly the last couple of years, or what we saw in 2022, some of the messages that were coming out, aware of warning, aware of precautions, aware of the behaviours that people need to adopt. There is some research that has been looking at the images that are used when it comes to heat in those types of publications, but also worth bearing in mind that heat is an invisible risk. It's difficult to take a picture of a heat wave. So you're needing to find these different anchors and narratives that people can relate to. So that's quite a difficult one to see. And the way in which heat impacts people, again, is somewhat invisible. It's not like flood risk or different types of risks. So it can be quite difficult for people to understand. But it would be about drawing together some of the existing tools and guidance that already exist, whether that's government guidance, whether it's from the Wildlife Trust, the British Red Cross, that do provide very guided information on the types of measures at the individual level that can be taken on board, seeing more of these types of campaigns. So we know in the London Underground, they have more posters around, make sure you carry water with you. This wasn't happening 10 or 15 years ago. So more of those types of initiatives need to be put in place. And then the question around priorities for policy, well, we would like to see a national heat risk strategy. That's what we would like to see. We would like those conversations to be happening now. We're talking about the next 12 months because we're not thinking about putting this in place in 5 years. We have a summer coming up. The summer that we experienced in 2022 is likely to happen more frequently. We had 40-degree heat for 1 day. That was just for 1 day. We had 5 heat periods, but if those 5 heat periods had all experienced 40-degree days consecutively, then our resources would have been really, really stretched.
I've just got a minor point. I appreciate it's near the end. I think we need our post-office documentary moment, which outlines the real issues. And we need to back that up with visible, as Candice has said, visible accounts. We need anecdotal accounts of what's been happening. We need to make this quite visual. We need a PR marketing campaign on this. It's not good enough that we say these numbers of 3,000 deaths. It doesn't land with people. We actually need to find out exactly why people are dying and where they're dying, and investigate that very carefully and critically. Look to understand which buildings and which workplaces have failed in supporting these vulnerable people.
Great, thank you all. So I think we might wrap up. We have a lot of questions here that are unanswered, and I'm hoping there's a way in which we can get those answers to you in some form or the other. We'll be sure to save these questions, and Candice, perhaps we can work out how to respond to them because we just have another couple of minutes left here. I think it would be helpful to just sort of pull together some of the things we learned today and go back to this question about what we do when we're looking ahead. And like Candice said, it's not about the next 10 years just in that time frame. It's actually looking at the next year and how we build up to those next 10 years and what we do in the immediate future as well. And for me, I'd say a couple of things that have stood out from this discussion. Now, one is to mainstream that narrative around the risks from heat. I think it's really important that we don't just see heat as this wonderful sort of time when we can go out and kind of get into swimwear, but rather that recognize that there are many vulnerabilities. There are a number of heat health impacts, particularly when you have existing comorbidities, and recognizing that and understanding what that means for oneself and mainstreaming that narrative around heat health and heat risks is really important. And then the second is to pick up on what Andy was saying about the architectural crisis that we have in the UK. I think heat actually provides us with this really important and necessary hook to go back to the built environment and be able to say that we need to really take our built environment seriously and take retrofitting it seriously, not just for all the energy and climate reasons that we already know about and that are incredibly important in themselves, but also because it has huge health implications. And it has huge implications for actually a number of different sustainable development goals, including productivity, including food security, and other kinds of issues. So really to be able to get the built environment to a place in our conversations and in implementation of these strategies where we can, sort of make it more resilient. So I would say sort of narrative-wise, and focusing on the built environment are, for me, some of the things that have really stood out. But all of that has to happen within the structure of a systems-based approach to heating, one that works at different levels of governance, one that is inclusive and that is just, and also is coordinated in its strategy. So I think we're at the hour. I'm just going to say thank you to our audience, to our panelists, to all the work that has been done by Candice and her team. And we look forward to taking this conversation further and talking with you all again. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.